Good evening and welcome. My name is Dr. Brian Henning. I'm a professor of philosophy and environmental studies at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, where I'm also the founder of the Gonzaga Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our first event of the 2023 lecture series. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Gonzaga University resides on the homelands of the Spokane tribal people, the people of the river. And it's only because of the Spokane tribal people that Gonzaga University exists, because it was they that invited us actually to this community 100 and some years ago. And we really respect and appreciate that invitation to this community and looked for ways specifically to honor that relationship in an ongoing way as we move into this climate future together. Our event today, as I mentioned, is hosted by the Gonzaga Climate Center, which is informed by a real abiding commitment to fighting for a just society and care for the planet. We exist to help serve our community in the Inland Northwest by promoting innovative interdisciplinary scholarship, teaching, consulting, and capacity building. Hosting events such as this is an example of that mission at work. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to share with you a little bit about the other events that you can attend this semester if you're interested. So we have our annual Spokane Candidates Climate Change Forum on October 4th. For the last 5 years, we have been hosting this annual event, inviting local candidates for office, mayor, city council, council president, to discuss in a nonpartisan opportunity how they would address climate change if they're elected to office. So you can join us on October 4th for that. And then we have a panel, which is on the rights of nature and indigenous advocacy perspectives with 2 tribal members and our Spokane River keeper, Jerry White, on September 19th. Then on the 27th, we'll be discussing Dr. Pat Farrow's work on hydrogen fuel cells. That event is on Friday at noon. And then the 15th of November, we have Dr. Deb Morrison from the University of Washington on the future of climate education in the United States. And then finally, our last event of this semester is on November 29th. Panel with attorneys from the Western Environmental Law Center discussing whether or not it's possible to solve the climate crisis at the speed and scale it requires while also protecting wild spaces. All these events are free and they will be live streamed. Many of them are live events here at Gonzaga University's campus, but we still figure out a way to live stream them to you. You can register for those at gonzaga.edu/climate center events. So again, if you go to gonzaga.edu/climate center events, you can register for any of these free events that'll be taking place over the next coming months. All of this work is only possible because of the support of generous folks across the country and around the world, helping us to bring important ideas and thought leaders to you free of charge. And if you have a few additional resources and you're willing to share them with us, we'd really appreciate that help to make it possible for us to continue and to expand our mission. We greatly appreciate it. During the talk, you'll notice that we're using a Zoom webinar tonight. And so that means that the chat feature is really just for communicating with the panelists. If you have a question during the event that you'd like to pose, which will be after the speaker's comments, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom and feel free to open that and pose a question at any point. I'll be moderating that after the speaker's comments. So take a look at that Q&A feature and start formulating your questions as you're listening to those comments. You can also, of course, adjust your view to the mode that works best for you. So feel free to orient your screen in the way that works in your preferred mode. So with that, let me introduce our speaker for tonight. We have with us Dr. Matthew Ballew. He's a research specialist at the Yale Program on climate change communication, specializes in social and environmental psychology research methods with a special focus on survey design and methods and program evaluation. His research focuses on the personal, social, and cultural factors that shape people's responses to environmental issues, how environments affect people's health and well-being, and how communicators can leverage this knowledge to more effectively connect with their audiences and support opinion and behavioral change. It's my great pleasure to join him this evening. This is a program at the Yale Center for Climate Communication that we draw on at the Gonzaga Climate Center frequently in our workshops with K-12 teachers. And I just learned that Matthew is actually in Olympia, Washington, just on the other side of the hills from us here in the same time zone. So welcome, Matthew. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henning. I'm super excited to be here today to share our research and our insights. So I'm going to go ahead and start my slide deck, and I'll share this at the end of today's webinar, so you can take it home if you'd like. All right, so let me get my slideshow going. Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting on our research from our Climate Change in the American Mind public opinion surveys that we do twice a year. I'll also be sharing some other research insights from research that we've done or what other researchers have done. And I'm going to talk about some challenges that we face when we're communicating with the public, but how we can, use those challenges as opportunities to overcome those issues and more connect with our audiences to facilitate public opinion change and also more action on climate change. So again, I'm Matthew Ballew. I'm a research specialist at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. And since it's a long name, we tend to go by YPCCC for short. And what we do, we conduct a lot of research on the public's beliefs, opinions, attitudes about climate change, and also their behavioral responses to climate change. But we also work with a lot of partners, educators, policymakers, a lot of organizers, to use our research and to help inform their efforts so they can better engage their audiences. And so some of the products that we produce, these are some of our most popular things we create. And Climate Change in the American Mind, it's a lot of research I'll be presenting today. But we also develop tools such as the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. I have them linked here. Again, I'll be giving you this slide deck so you can check out our resources and tools. We also have climate opinion fact sheets so you can print out anything related to your local community and what people in your area think about. And I'll be presenting some of that research that we find when we look at state level or county level data. And then also one of our most popular products is the Global Warming 6 Americas, and I'll be presenting on that as well. So starting off with the Global Warming 6 Americas, I'm going to ask you a question in a second about how many Americans you think are alarmed or concerned. But those folks in America, but also we can look at this globally, which is some of the international research we do. Alarmed Americans, they're most worried about global warming. The concerned, they're also worried, but not as much as the alarmed. The cautious, this is the audience that tends to be, questioning climate change. Is it happening? Is it real? Is it human caused? Should I be worried about it? And then you start moving on the other side of the spectrum, where people tend to have the lowest belief in global warming. They're least worried about it, least motivated to act. The disengaged, they tend to be checked out. They rarely hear about it. They rarely engage with it. The doubtful are closer to the dismissive side, right? They doubt the science behind it, but they might be a little bit more movable than the people all the way on the far right, which are the dismissive audiences who tend to reject the reality of climate change and the science behind it. And they're the least concerned and least motivated to act. So I told you I was going to ask you a question. So what I want you to do is either pull out your phones and scan the QR code, or you can go in the chat or type in the link that I'll be posting in the chat in a second. Let me be able to send that link in the chat. All right, so once you're able to scan that QR code or access Poll Everywhere, I want you to, let me activate it first. I want you to, in the Poll Everywhere, guess what percentage of US adults are alarmed or concerned about global warming. And so those are the people that tend to be more worried about climate change. The alarmed are most worried and the concerned aren't far too behind. So what percentage of US adults are alarmed or concerned? Thank you, Brian, for sending it as a link.
I got you back.
All right, so I'm going to be going to those results in a second. All right. So we're seeing most people, 28% of you all, are in the 61 to 70%. And we got a few people that are in the 51, 60%. Seems like we're spread across the board. So about half of you think less than half of Americans, and about half of you think more than half of Americans. Just roughly, I'm looking at here, eyeballing it. So it seems like you're pretty split, maybe a little bit more on the less than half side. So I'm going to share with you actually the results of this research that we do. And so we find that 53%, half of Americans, are either alarmed or concerned about climate change. Conversely, right, that compared to other side of the spectrum, the doubtful or dismissive audiences, right, that's half the size of people who are alarmed or concerned about climate change. So we know that many Americans are worried about climate change. They care about it. And so that's one thing I want to drill in today when I go over our public opinion research. I also want you to guess which segment you think has grown the most over the last decade. So let me activate that poll, get the other one off. And again, I want you to, to the best of your knowledge, guess which segment do you think has grown the most over the last decade? The alarmed, the concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive? Thank you, Brian, for sending that poll everywhere. Whoa, I do not want to show you the results just yet. Let's take a look. See some posts in the chat. All right. So we see a lot of people here who are guessing that the alarmed or the concerned have grown the most. That's good for you folks who guessed that, because that is what we have found is actually the alarmed segment in particular has grown the most over the last decade. So you can see the concerned actually has stayed relatively the same over the last decade. The alarmed segment has increased the most. In contrast, the cautious, which is in the middle of the spectrum, they're questioning climate change. They have gone down in size over the last decade, and the other segments have remained relatively the same. So you can see there are trends in a positive direction, right? Americans are becoming more worried about climate change. So I want to emphasize this trend. Most Americans have pro-climate opinions. This trend has been growing over the last decade. So let me show you some other results specifically. So we know that most Americans think climate change, global warming is happening. Nearly 3 out of 4 think it's happening, and this trend has been increasing over the last decade. We also know that most Americans think that global warming is mostly human caused. 61% in our latest survey. This was our spring survey that we did, and we do these twice a year, spring and fall. Our next one will be coming up in the fall. Most Americans think global warming is human caused. Trend also has been increasing over the last decade. Most Americans, 2/3, are worried about global warming. You can also see here that nearly 1 in 3 Americans are very worried about global warming, and this has increased over the last decade. Pro-climate trends. Many Americans also have said they've personally experienced the effects of global warming, the impacts of climate change. Just under half have said so. And this also has increased over the last decade. Also, most people have risk perceptions that climate change is harming the US right now. So about half of Americans think that global warming is harming the US right now, and this trend has increased pretty strongly over the last decade. We also know that about 2/3 of Americans think global warming is affecting the weather. About 1 in 3 say it's affecting the weather a lot. So I was showing you, right, that many Americans, most Americans care about global warming. They're worried about it, and they think that it's affecting the US, think that it's affecting the weather. Also, I want to emphasize that most Americans support solutions, specifically policies that take action on climate change. So this is referring to data and research from our policy and politics report that we do also twice a year. So it's part of our biannual public opinion surveys on climate change. And so you can see here that most registered voters in the US think developing sources of clean energy should be a high or very high priority for the president and Congress. And this is also including many Republicans. Now you'll probably note, right, that there is a specific subgroup of Republicans who tend to deviate from other Republicans, and those are the conservative Republicans. And you'll see that trend happening all the way through these other slides I'll be showing. But the point is, right, most registered voters support climate change and support solutions. So you can also see that here, right? Most registered voters, 2 out of 3 or more, also including many of those moderate liberal Republicans, they support climate-friendly energy policies. So you can even see here that some of these policies are specifically what's in the Inflation Reduction Act and the provisions that they're trying to provide, and also other activities that the Inflation Reduction Act is performing. And again, right, you can see that, and I don't want you to pay attention to those so much, that conservative Republicans deviate from the other Republicans in their party. Most registered voters support climate policy. One thing I want to talk about specifically is the Inflation Reduction Act. Since I was just showing you, right, most Americans support provisions that are involved in the IRA. But what's really interesting is that most registered voters haven't heard much about it. 39% say they have heard a lot or some about the IRA. You can see that there's not much political polarization here. Groups are pretty similar to one another, but you can see that Republicans and Democrats, more on the left or the right side of the spectrum, have heard about it. It's the moderates who tend to have heard about it less. And what's interesting here too is that afterwards, right, when we get everybody on the same page and we tell everyone what the Inflation Reduction Act is, most, right, 71% of registered voters support it. And that's also including many Republicans, as we were seeing in the other graphs that we were looking at. Now, another thing I want to share with you all is that many demographic groups that haven't heard much about the Inflation Reduction Act are actually most supportive of it after learning about it. So this includes Black Americans, households that earn less than $50,000 a year, lower income households, women, and also younger Americans. They tend to have heard about it less, but are more likely to support it after learning about it. So there's a communication opportunity there, right? Talking about the IRA, educating people about the provisions and what it does and how it can help them. So as we've been going over, right, there's clearly public support for taking action on climate change. But why isn't there more action on climate change? Part of this, right, there's a political divide, there's a partisan divide, it's a political issue that's been becoming increasingly politicized over the last 10, 20 years. As you can see in our graphs too, that the difference between Democrats and Republicans has been widening over time. But why aren't we taking more action when there's so many Americans who believe in climate change, are worried about it, support climate policy? So I'm going to be going over some challenges, but also the opportunities, right? That we can positively reframe these challenges to work with communities, to work with audiences, to connect with them, to shape their pro-climate views, right? We want to promote those, but we also want to strengthen people's behavioral response to taking action on climate change. And so that's getting at the public's will, right? To actually do something, to influence corporations, to influence other people, to influence, right, action on climate change. And then also political will, right? That's a really important aspect to all of this, is we want people to feel confident. We want people to actually get involved politically. And that can be in many different ways, right? It can just be talking about climate change, but also engaging with politicians, contacting them, and so on. Because without public support, right, there won't be any policy changes. And so we got to keep that in mind. So I want to do another poll with you all. I want you all to guess. Let me activate the survey before I go over the results. Hopefully you didn't see that too quickly. I want you to, best of your knowledge, guess what percentage of US adults discuss global warming with family and friends, at least occasionally? Occasionally or often? Thank you for sharing that link again. Oh, there's a limit on the number of responses. That's what I get for having a free poll everywhere account.
You've got too many people interested, Dr. Ballew, so have to get you the subscription so you can get the higher number of responses. We got 111 people with us tonight, so that's great.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. It's good to know as I move forward. I'll have to get that paid prescription. You see, this is how they get you with these things. Thank you. Well, hopefully, right, the more responses we have, we're getting closer to a more reliable estimate that we can trust. But I apologize to the people that aren't able to participate and provide their response here. It is valued. So most of you, right, are in the 61, 70% range here. So it looks like a fair amount of you, maybe even more than half, are saying most Americans talk about climate change with family and friends at least occasionally. But we also got a big chunk of people who are saying on the lower side. It's probably the people who actually saw the data, who saw the real population statistic here. And so people that guessed between 31 and 40%, you are right. So let me go over those results. Most Americans rarely talk about climate change, rarely or never, right? So you can see 66% in our last survey said they talk about climate change, global warming, specifically with family and friends, at least occasionally, or sorry, rarely or never. It's 66%. Fewer, about 1 in 3, say they do at least occasionally. So you can see here that there's a gap between people's beliefs about climate change and their communication behaviors. And they care about it, they're worried about it, they support climate policy, but they're not really talking about it. And also, fewer than half of Americans perceive that people who are close to them, family and friends, care about climate change. So you can see that 41% say that their family and friends make at least a moderately, or they're, sorry, I'm flipping this around, that the effort that they perform is moderately important to the family and friends. And also you can see here that 38% say that, I just realized that these are flipped, that 38% say that it's moderately important to their family and friends that they take action on global warming. And so this is showing you here that less than half of Americans think, right, that their family and friends think it's moderately important to take action on climate change, or that they're making a moderate amount of effort on climate change. So people have these misperceptions. Even though most people care, most people are worried about it, they're less likely to think others actually think so. And so you can also see, right, in contrast, that most Americans, 2 in 3, say the issue of global warming is personally important to them. So this is to show you the contrasts, right, between what we think others believe, especially people that are close to us, our family and friends, and also what they actually believe individually, personally. So just to recap, right, Americans rarely talk about their climate views, and there are misperceptions of what other people think. And so a few years ago in 2019, we actually asked in our public opinion surveys, we asked Americans, just like what I've been having you do, to the best of their knowledge, what percentage of Americans think that global warming is happening. And we found there, right, if you look at this light blue bar in the middle, the general US population estimated that about 54% of Americans, about half, think that climate change is happening. When actually, at that time in 2019, 69% said global warming is happening. So you can see there's a gap here. And this has obviously increased since we've been doing our surveys over the last 4 years. That's 74% now. So I'm just providing that context to you because this is a little bit old data. So there's this misperception. Now there's an opportunity here, right? We can use this information because we know there are misperceptions, but we know that people individually care about climate change, right? To amplify that message, to tell people, right? This is actually what people believe. This is what they care about. And so we know from a lot of research that social norms, social influence strategies can be particularly effective. And so there was this recent meta-analysis, which is research that combines a bunch of studies together. And they even combined other meta-analyses in this meta-analysis. So it's like a meta-meta-analysis. And they wanted to estimate, looking at all these different types of interventions on climate change mitigation behaviors, how to promote them, right? They found that social norm interventions were among the most effective instigators of climate change mitigation behavior. So we know they're effective. So we can encourage people, right, to talk about climate change, to influence others individually. That's one behavior, and it's the number one behavior that I recommend to people if they're like, what can I do to fight climate change? It's the easiest thing everyone can do is talk about your concern, talk about how much you care, talk about how you're personally impacted by climate change, how it affects your mental health, how it affects your community, right? How it's actually affected you. And we know extreme weather, right, has especially been impacting us and globally, right, this summer with the heat waves and also everything else that's going on, wildfires, flooding. So Dr. Catherine Hayhoe is one of my favorites, and she's a climate scientist at the she's a climate scientist and she's the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. She's also a Christian and a mom, and so she has this great TEDx talk, and I have it linked here in the slide deck that I'll provide you at the end of this presentation. And that's her number one recommendation too, right? Is talk about climate change. So I'm just alongside Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. And we also know from research that talking about climate change can lead to greater acceptance among those who talk about it. So not even just other people get affected, but even the people themselves, if they're told to talk about it, that it can also change their beliefs and they can become stronger believers of climate change and become more worried about it as they talk about it with family and friends. So also part of this process, right, is to correct for public misperceptions because we know there's that gap, right? We call this pluralistic ignorance when we think that others don't care when in reality, they individually, personally do care. And so what we want to do is correct for those misperceptions and really emphasize the social consensus, right? Most people do care. They think global warming is happening. So this is research from our Yale climate opinion maps. And you can see here that across every state in the US, majorities of Americans think global warming is happening. So that is one simple message you can use to emphasize social consensus when you're communicating with people. Also, as part of this too, right? It's not just most Americans think global warming is happening, but also we know that 97% of scientists, climate scientists, agree that global warming is happening and that it's human caused. So that is a gateway belief that we can also use to get people to change their beliefs about climate change, right? Once they understand this statistic, then it can spill over into their own individual beliefs and worries. And this has been found in several research studies that telling people about the scientific consensus can persuade them to change their own beliefs. And this is especially important because if you see here, 1 in 5 Americans actually understand that 97% of climate scientists agree. Right? And that's similar to the amount of people who say they don't know. So about 1 in 5, almost 1 in 4 people say they don't know. So there's an opportunity here, right? Correct for those misperceptions. Provide social and scientific consensus. Social licensing, if you will. And part of this too, right, is not just correcting for misperceptions, but promoting and amplifying, right, those pro-climate social norms, right? Most people care. Most people are worried. You can see right across almost all of the states, except for West Virginia, majorities of people are worried about global warming. Most people also think that global warming will harm future generations, and we find this across all US states. Most people care, I keep saying that, right? Amplifying those pro-climate social norms. Also, there's another challenge here, right? Most of you are probably aware of this, probably have experienced it yourself, but climate change, right? It's abstract, right? People tend to view it as distant in time and space. It's slow moving. They won't be personally affected, but it's going to affect other people, right? Future generations more than it's going to affect them personally. It's going to affect plant animal species more than it's going to affect them personally. So you can see actually there's this trend here. If you look at all the different groups, when we ask people, how much do you think global warming will harm these different groups? People think them personally will be affected much less than these other groups, right? As you start to move up toward the right on the graph, you can see that these groups start to get larger in size. So, right, there's this bias here, and this is part of just a cognitive bias that we have as humans generally. But there's an opportunity, right? We can work with this and we can personalize and localize climate issues, right? Making climate change here and now, connecting it to extreme weather, connecting to how it's impacting their community, connecting to how they are personally impacted. So that's, returning back to that one talking point about how you are personally affected by climate change. You can make people experience it here and now when you're sharing those stories. We know from research that experience, right, can be a powerful teacher. People who experience very hot, dry days, for instance, like the heat waves we've been experiencing this summer, or people who've experienced extreme weather events like hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, it can change their minds about climate change. But it's also not just experiencing it yourself, but also vicariously experiencing it through other people, right? Hearing about it, seeing other people be personally affected by climate change. Those stories can also change people's minds, right? So that's why I talk about how you can engage in climate change just by talking about how you're personally affected by it. We also know, right, there's an opportunity here when communicating with people about how they're personally affected, right, localize and personalize those climate issues, connect the dots to extreme weather, connect the dots to other environmental problems. We know most Americans are worried about these things, extreme heat, droughts, flooding, wildfires. They're worried about it. And so the more that we can connect, right, climate change and how it leads to extreme weather, right, and how it personally affects them, the more we can start to personalize these issues, the more we can reduce that cognitive bias that it's distant in time and space. It is here and now. And people actually think this. Many people think that global warming is affecting extreme weather and environmental problems at least a little. But you can see here, less people think that it's affecting these problems or extreme weather events a lot. And so this is why there's a good education opportunity here to really educate the public and make it here and now. Also, as part of this opportunity, right, is connecting to people's identities. So this is showing you the ability of the Yale Climate Opinion Maps, that it's a tool, right, where you can look at just the US and public opinion across all the states, but you can also zoom into specific areas, into congressional districts, to counties. And so this may be a way that people can use that information to really connect with their audiences, right? So 69% of people in Washington, I think that global warming is affecting the weather at least a little. And then we can even zoom in a little bit more and look specifically, for instance, Spokane County, where Gonzaga University is. We can see that 62% of people in Spokane County think that global warming is affecting the weather at least a little bit. So most people, right, in this area think global warming is affecting the weather at least a little. We can also amplify social norms related to these identities, right? Really connect with people like, hey, look, people in your state. Well, I'm sure some of you are in different states, of course. But look, most people in Washington think local officials should do more to address global warming. In Spokane County specifically, most people also think local officials should do more. Right? So it's really amplifying. Right? Most people think this. Most people support action to correct for those misperceptions and promote those pro-climate opinions, a shift in beliefs, which can ultimately maybe even get them to take action. And also part of this, right, there's focusing on solutions as societal gains. What's in it for me? How is my community going to be benefited? And that's where solutions come in. We know from our research that many people, there's large support for climate change policy. And also there's bipartisan support for several climate change policies. And people may incorrectly perceive, right, there's more political polarization around policy than there actually is. There's research to support that. And I have some of that linked here in these slides. So emphasizing, right, that support for solutions. Most support tax rebates for buying electric vehicles, energy efficient vehicles. Most support clean energy. And one thing that I also want to drill into, right, is focusing on solutions as societal gains as a way to inspire hope. Right? There's a lot of doom and gloom involved in climate change. but it's also important to emphasize the benefits, the co-benefits. There are several co-benefits to the economy, to health, public infrastructure, right? So inspiring hope is one really good way to leverage those solutions as societal gain, as an effect from talking about them. And so this is one statistic I really love to share to maybe help inspire hope and also teach kids about, right, technologies and the clean energy future and the benefits of the clean energy future. That most Americans think that schools should teach about the causes, consequences, and solutions to global warming. And I find that a very hopeful finding because we find large support across all 50 states. We should be educating our kids. And another thing, right? Most people don't know how to take action, or there's some other things that may be in the way. There are barriers for them to take action. And so what we want to do is try and reduce that gap. We want to help overcome these barriers because we know that many people are willing to engage in action. Specifically, if we look at political actions, as you see here, many are willing to engage. Now, this is also showing there's a political divide around it. But if you focus on that black diamond, you can see that 1 in 3 Americans, roughly on average, are willing to engage in political actions. And so how do we actually tap into that, right? How do we motivate people, more people to take action? And so this is some research that we did several years ago in 2017. And I know it's a little bit dated, but it's still important. We asked people, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statements regarding contacting elected officials about global warming specifically? And so you can generalize these to maybe any type of political action, but getting people to contact officials is a really great way to take political action, right? And so you can identify that maybe this would spill over into other types of behaviors. The number one statement that people agreed with is that nobody has ever asked me. People just haven't been asked to contact their elected official. Following that, it wouldn't make any difference. Right, so trying to educate people that, right, you can take action, you can make a difference, just like voting. I am not an activist was also ranked highly. So people have this conceptualization about what activism is that could be a barrier to them participating in something like this. I don't know which elected officials to contact, and I wouldn't know what to say. You can see that these are actually greater than those more practical constraints that we might think people will say that I'm too busy, it's too much of an effort. Right, so these are some opportunities that we can educate people on what to say, make it easy for them to do these things and motivate them, right? Remind them that they can make a difference and really build that efficacy, that collective efficacy that together, right, as individuals, we can affect policy. And right, the one that I love to harp on, according to Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, the most important thing you can do to fight climate change is to talk about it. So encouraging people, right, is the easiest thing that they can do to talk about the climate. Now I've gone over some challenges and opportunities, but one key thing that we also really need to emphasize here, and this is going to circle back to what I was talking about at the beginning of my presentation, are the global warming 6 Americas. But we want to know the audiences that we're trying to connect to, that we're working with, right? We really want to understand their values, their motives, what they care about, so that we can connect with them and try and connect the dots, right? To get them to maybe change their beliefs about climate change, maybe nudge them to take more action. And so this is where the 6 Americas come in, right? What we do is we try to identify these audiences, and we even connect this research that we do to voter files so that we can go specifically target certain groups of people that might have, high rates of alarmed or concerned people in their area in order to, right, really try and connect these people to actions that they can take to have a greater impact on climate change. And so that's really focusing on organizing half of the American public, those alarmed and concerned audiences. On the other side of the spectrum are the cautious, disengaged, doubtful, but also the concerned, right? Because they're not as concerned about climate change as the alarmed. So we want to try and elevate their worry as well and inspire more action too among the concerned. So really educating and engaging those folks more. And that's about 1 in 3 if we're going to exclude the concerned from this segment here. 1 in 3 people are cautious, disengaged, and doubtful. So they can move up on the spectrum. Now you can see that we don't really tend to put effort into the dismissive group. They tend to reject the reality of climate change and science. So we really want to focus on groups that have a little bit more potential to move. But of course, there are ways to connect with people. Right? That's one of the more important things, is know your audiences, know how you can talk with them, how you can share a story with them that might impact them. Right? Connect the dots between climate change and extreme weather and its impacts on communities, and how taking action on climate change can lead to co-benefits that's going to benefit them and their communities and also the environment. Going over that connection, right? Using weathercasters as one way, as trusted messengers, right, to broaden that message. But also there are many other things that we talked about today. And this is just a recap of everything that we've gone over, maybe not everything, but most of it. Right? Talking about social norms, amplifying pro-climate social norms, sharing experiences, asking people to get involved, overcoming those barriers to action, which are potentially the hardest things to deal with. We know there's an attitude behavior gap. People are concerned, but they don't know what to do. They don't know how to take action. There are other things in the way. So making it easy for people, connecting them to groups, but also breaking that spiral of silence. I can't go over that one enough, talking about climate change, because there's also misperceptions around what we think others believe. And also an important one is motivating people, right? Inspiring hope, inspiring that, right? We have the solutions, we have the technologies available to address the climate crisis. And it's just that we need to really leverage those technologies and solutions right now to address it. And also one thing that I haven't talked so much about is the importance of trusted messengers. People have to feel like the person they're being communicated to or from is someone they can trust, someone who is credible, someone that they identify with. It's a very important point. Republicans are more likely to be influenced by other Republicans. And also one thing that's important here is simple messages, right? Simple messages can go a long way. That's why simply talking about social consensus or scientific consensus, most people care, right? 97% scientists agree human-caused climate change is happening, right? Those are simple messages that we can repeat very often. We also have a simple message we like to share, and that's 5 facts in 10 words. It's real, it's us, it's bad, scientists agree, but there's hope, right? So you can go over that whenever you're trying to communicate with somebody in just one simple framework in order to engage the audiences you're working on. So that's all I got today. I know it's a lot, but I look forward to our conversation. And again, I'll be sharing my slide deck right now in the chat. And also, if you want to reach out to us, our partnerships director is probably the best person if you ever want to partner with us or talk about anything we do. All righty. So thank you all. Let's get talking.
One of the dissatisfying things about this mode, of course, of a webinar is you don't have the raucous applause at the end of a nice talk. So just imagine that everybody is in their pajamas, sort of thanking you for a wonderful talk. And so hopefully everybody can see. Actually, I think, Dr. Ballew, that only went to me and you. So you might try posting that again in the chat to everybody so that folks, if they want to download your deck, which is very generous of you, they can do that. Thanks. So everybody, if you haven't already, start to think about what you'd like to talk about. And we have a little bit of time together with our speaker. So go to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you should be able to pose some questions. While you're collecting your thoughts, I'm going to start off with a question or two. So let's start with what are the main themes that you talked about, and sort of the hey-ho sort of, it was sort of grabbed off my shelf. The hey-ho's one of her most recent. So you talked about needing to talk about it, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to clarify. It almost made it sound like you're saying it doesn't really matter what you talk about, just talk about it. And I'm thinking of the research which suggests that trying to explain the science to them, explain to them why they just don't understand the science, and is not necessarily the right approach for most people. Anyway, just want to give you a window to talk a little bit more about the you just don't understand. Let me explain how climate science works to you, sort of a problem. A little bit more on that, if you would.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the number one thing you don't want to do is have people distance themselves from you. So, telling people like, oh, you don't understand, or let me explain this to you, can create this rift, right? This dynamic where you have more power than they do, and then they might just become defensive and shut down. And I like that you brought this up, right? We don't want to just talk about it like in a way that's superior to other people. Like, I know more than you. So there are some tactics, and you can find them online. I can even go and find some links. But even just typing into Google how to talk about climate change, you'll probably find resources that will be very helpful. Is you really just want to connect with the person you're talking about. You want to understand what they care about, ask them questions, learn a little bit more about their perspective. You want to create, right, this quote unquote, that we use this word often, that safe space where people can share what they think without judgment. And so there is research out there suggesting that lack of judgment, non-judgmental, neutral conversations are the most effective way to talk with people. And so this is from research done on deep canvassing and how that is effective in connecting with people, right? When people don't feel judged and they feel like you're neutral and you're just trying to learn about them, that you're curious about what they have to say, they're more likely to connect with you and you're more likely to connect with them. And then you can even use that information, what they care about, in order to try and guide the conversation and connect the dots for them.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We've got a few questions popping in. I forgot to mention that I enabled the option for people to upvote questions. So you can participate in upvoting questions, just meaning it, saying you think that question's a good one too, and you'd like me to pose it. But for now, I'm just going to start at the top. So Caleb Naylor asks, how do we approach the sentiment of, quote, what I do as an individual won't matter because X corporation does most of the damage, or X country won't change, or Y country won't change? This seems like a communication dilemma because it's coming from people who may believe and be concerned, but are disillusioned.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's part of these biases that we have as humans, right? We look at other people, we look what they're doing, and if they're not doing anything, if they're not taking action, that can influence us to feel like, hey, well, why should I do it? Why should I be responsible for taking action when these corporations, these companies are more responsible for it, the big oil companies, right? And so this is a dynamic that is just fundamentally difficult to deal with. And so ways that we can try and work with that is telling people to take action in small ways, reminding them that they can make a difference, even if it's small, even if it's not a big impact. And that could be as simply as talking about it, talking about how they're concerned, or going out and voting, right? And so obviously we want people to take larger actions, like actually contacting their officials, volunteering for organizations, engaging with it a little bit more. But we have to recognize that people are just at different parts of the spectrum, right? They're different audiences, they have different motivations, levels of engagement, and levels of willingness to do so. And so that's just something we have to recognize and acknowledge, right? But we can also tell people that, hey, you can affect these corporations just by using an individual, by not engaging with that company, by not supporting them, right? By directing your efforts elsewhere and engaging with companies and corporations that are doing more sustainable things, that are trying to help the environment. And even just talking about that with other people can also be a way to motivate people a little bit more to take action. Right? That, hey, there's these giant companies out here who are responsible. Why aren't they being taxed for how they're harming the environment, contributing to climate change? So there are ways that you can use that, right, as fuel, if you will, to try and motivate people to take action, even in the smallest way.
To add in and connect to something you'd said earlier, those the localization of it and the local stories can be another sort of response to the disillusionment sort of problem, right? Where you shrink it from a a global impossible issue to thinking about how does it affect your community and what things can you do to help your community be more resilient or to reduce its impact. So I think that's another nice technique that you had mentioned that can help in that context.
Yes, absolutely.
My colleague Bi Zhao asks, can you please share some information about the respondents? For example, the sample size of the data, the demographic distribution regarding geography, gender, age, political ideology. A version of this question, I think, I'd like to sort of push that question even further if I could, and maybe just quickly share my screen and to ask that question in another way. So you're talking about the opinion map. And so if we zoom in on Spokane County here, on the question of, let's say, worried about global warming, and we get the answer that it's 62% compared to 65% in the United States. Is it misleading? So I'm curious about Bi Zhao's question too about sort of methodology, but my question is kind of a methodology question too, a little more specific. So is it misleading to say 62% of people in Spokane County think that are worried about climate change when the data, it's the methodology itself is modeled, not survey. There wasn't a survey of people in Spokane County, I think, if I'm understanding correctly.
Right.
It was that wasn't the methodology used. And so is it misleading to do that? So if you could, it's a kind of a two-parter, but it's sort of a specific and a general, like, can we cite those data and say that it's true that Spokane County has X percentage of views, or do we have to qualify it? And then on this general question of methodology and that Dr. Zhao is asking, it'd be useful to hear about that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is an excellent question. I'm glad you're connecting it to the Yale climate opinion maps because they're related. And so I'm just going to share real quick a link to in the chat, just our demographics and methods, which are comparable across surveys, right? We use Ipsos, which is a national polling agency. And so they do nationally representative surveys. They use probability sampling techniques to reach essentially all available households in the US. And so they do this through rigorous probability sampling methods. And so then afterwards, right, they use weighting procedures in order to match the groups that are in the survey to Census Bureau statistics and parameters so that we can make sure that we're actually representing the population through our surveys. And so generally a rule of thumb in any national poll is you got to have at least 1,000 respondents. And then afterwards, right, you have just your margin of error, your reliability of that estimate, it becomes less than plus or minus 3% of the percentage point. And as you increase your sample size, you don't need to do that so much anymore. If you know information about probability and statistics, that margin of error just gets smaller and smaller. But plus or minus 3 is generally that margin of error that we work with, and we're happy with that number, that there's some wiggle room that our estimate of what the population thinks is going to be plus or minus 3 percentage points within this number. And so that's also relates to the Yale climate opinion maps, that we can be confident that our model estimates are around plus or minus 3 percentage points at these different levels, these different scales that we look at the public. And so this is a method called downscaling. And so what it does is it uses all of the data that we have available, and we need at least 5,000 participants in order to start downscaling. And so it uses a model and it predicts in specific areas, more localized areas, what the parameter is going to be in that area, what the statistic will be. And so just like any research we study, any research study we do, there's some error. Just like what I was talking about before with national polls, plus or minus 3 percentage points is what we deal with the margin of error. And we also deal with that with the model estimates we produce. And so there's a rigorous study, and you can even find it linked in the slides. I have it, I think, several times when I present on the Yale climate opinion map that compares, right, these estimates to actual national population parameters, things that we conducted in the survey. And we can find that these estimates are things we can rely on, of course, with some degree of uncertainty, but uncertainty that is okay and is not abnormal for research that we can do.
So if I'm hearing it correctly, would not be misleading to cite 62% of people in Spokane County are worried about global warming with an error margin of, right? And so you sort of add on that at 3% error bar, that would be a way of sort of accurately, that would be a fair way of representing that data.
Yeah, as an average margin of error. Now,
as an
that
average
would,
margin of error. Okay.
yeah, it would differentiate, right? If you were to actually try and calculate the estimated margin of error for that specific area. But, just as a rule of thumb, that is our average margin of error that we work with, that we can be comfortable.
Gotcha. If Dr. Zhao, if you have more questions on this, feel free to pop them in the Q&A, but we'll keep moving forward. Grace Fletcher, one of our students here at Gonzaga, asks, how would you recommend speaking to people about environmental issues that don't immediately affect them? For example, climate change impacts everybody, but biodiversity loss doesn't directly impact everyone. Advice for addressing less direct topics with others? Question mark.
This is a good question. I mean, you could be in an area where you're not directly affected by climate change, but there are ways that you can try and connect the dots. And so one way to talk about this, right, is the economy or public infrastructure. So that climate change, right, is going to lead to more frequent and more intense extreme weather events, which are going to harm communities, are going to harm areas, and that's going to cause problems to public infrastructure. And then you can talk about how these problems of public infrastructure, right, are then going to be costly, and that these things are going to require interventions. It's going to require change and solutions to recover from those changes. And that's going to cost the economy, and right, that's going to require people to actually do things in those communities. And so also, this is going to affect people's health. And as we know, right, we can connect this to the pandemic when we had the influx of people who were getting COVID, right? They were taxing the healthcare system. And so then the healthcare system had to deal with overload, and they also deal with staffing shortages. And so you can see that like there are ways that you can talk about the dots here and the chains of how it might not directly affect them, but it's going to indirectly affect areas around them, which then will eventually trickle down to affecting them personally. Now, of course, you'd want to be careful with how you talk about this so that it's not, right, what we were talking about earlier about being superior, about, what you know and how these things are going to happen. And so I think that's why, one way to go about those conversations is to talk about how you feel, how you are personally affected by this, rather than maybe saying, all these things about how you will be affected, but more talking about how you are and maybe just relating it to you specifically. And you could even unpack all these different things that I just mentioned as just some examples, how it's going to affect the economy, and that might affect you, and how it's going to affect other things.
Another way of putting this in more concisely, I'm curious if you would agree that in the end, right now, this is no longer a scientific problem, it's a communication problem. Like, would you go so far as to say climate change is no longer a scientific problem, it's primarily a communication problem? Would you go that far and say that that's the primary problem that it is now? So we understand the problem, science has done its job.
I would be in the boat of saying yes. We've understood enough. We've reached saturation of knowledge, of knowing this is a crisis. And we have the technologies, we have the solutions to act and to do things, and to address it. And so, yeah, it is, a communication issue. It's a social problem. It's getting people on board. It's changing their beliefs and attitudes, and also trying to connect them to more ways they can take action.
If you've got a little bit more time, a couple more if you're willing.
Yeah, of course.
So Sophia asks, says, I have family members who fully deny or don't believe that climate change is real. Are there any specific talking points, facts and figures, or other things that you would recommend when approaching the topic of global warming with them? You hinted briefly at this in your presentation, saying that in the 6 Americas, in the dismissive category, which was, I think, 11%, that I think you said you don't primarily recommend trying to engage with those people, at least in the same way. So is your answer to Sophia, don't try?
Yeah, this one's a difficult one, of course, and you have to, also gauge your bandwidth and your capacity to have these conversations because they are emotionally intense and they are laborious for you to engage in. So if you're not feeling up to it, it's probably best to drop it. And one thing that I've read by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe as well as others is knowing that this is a long-term thing when you're trying to communicate with somebody. It's not that you're going to try and convince them right then and there to change their beliefs, that it's a gradual process and it's about really trying to open the door for them to be more open themselves to maybe think about this a little bit more, think about it a little bit more critically. And so some ways that you can maybe go about this is try to identify what they care about and what they think would actually be a solution. Like what do you think we should do? And so this is where, asking those questions comes in and really listening to them and really showing that you're interested in what they have to say, right? With no judgment, being neutral, being curious. And that's a way that you can connect with them and make them feel comfortable. And you can even use that knowledge to kind of try and be like, well, that solution, that thing you mentioned, like, do you think it's actually possible? Like, what's another way we could go about it? What do you think we should do? And so also trying to get them to think critically is part of the process too, because very often, right, these people are getting fed information that they just instantly believe. And so getting them to think a little bit more critically about these processes can maybe even potentially open up the door for them to question some of the things that they've heard about. So that's where critical thinking skills comes in. Really good question.
The tough one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. One last question. Shelby asks, how do we decrease the politicization between the far left and the far right? Is presumably on climate in particular. Talking about climate change works with the people around us, but how do we get this to change politics in the United States to advance climate solutions, especially within the time frame of the Paris Climate Agreement?
Yeah, this is a big problem, right? Political polarization has increased over the last 10, 20 years. And how are we as individuals, how we can actually address this partisan divide and try and reduce it, right? That's just as big as the collective problem we face with the climate change crisis, because if this is part of the issue, is why we're not taking action, is that political divide and the arguments on solutions. And so this kind of talks just about a little bit more, speaking more to just this abstract problem that we face, or not abstract problem, but this global collective problem that we face, that we as individuals, how can we affect the group? How can we affect this very large movement? And so individually, right, we can do these things. We can try and nudge people around us. We can go out and start to engage in probably more of those collective approaches where we vote, where we work with other organizations, we volunteer for them. And so participating in your community, trying to educate other people at that broader collective level is a way that you can start, you as an individual, starting to make more of a collective impact when you start to engage in these more bigger collective behaviors, if you will. And so your question is a really good one, and it's a hard one for me to completely answer because it's just like, how are we going to address the collective problem of climate change? So I hope that, that gives you maybe some motivation in order to deal with that difficult difficult barrier that we have to deal with.
All the hardest questions tonight. Maybe one last, it was just in the chat from a listener, is really just informational about the Yale program, when it started. How long has Yale been working on this?
So since 2008, we've been doing our national polls on Americans' beliefs about climate change. And so it started a little bit before that, obviously, but yeah, it's been about 15 years.
Excellent. Well, it's a really great resource. I'm going to put, again, the link to your deck, and then also a link to the visualizations. If you could just go to Yale Climate, or I'm sorry, climatecommunication.yale.edu, you can get to what is it? You said it was YPCCC. So I'm getting the, that's good to know how to refer to the lingo. Let's give Dr. Ballew one more round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's really generous of you. This is really interesting and important work, and a lot of people around the world are trying to figure out how to communicate with their neighbors and friends about this thing that's affecting so many of us. And if it's now shifting from primarily a science issue to a communication issue, then your work becomes really important. So thank you for sharing it. I hope everybody out there finds ways to share this work too. This has been recorded, as you can see. We will be posting that on our YouTube channel. So please do look for it there. You can find it within the next day or two. Remember that we have a number of great events coming up this semester. You can go to gonzaga.edu/climate center events. Please sign up for our mailing list. And if you're able to, consider supporting us through a donation. Thank you so much, Dr. Ballew, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Good night, everybody. See you next time.